Serious and Pete podcast, Mobbed Up. Yeah, if you want to talk about it.
There's three main quote-unquote mafia organizations in Italy. The one we're going to talk about today is the most popular, which is Sicilian/American Cosa Nostra. In this case, we're going to be talking about the American Cosa Nostra, which has its roots in Sicily, but there have been non-Sicilian. Nowadays, it's just Italian-American, even if it did have its roots as a Sicilian organization in the States. So the structure is, at the end of the day, the mafia is, it's kind of like cut into families, and those families make up a larger organization of Cosa Nostra, which essentially means our thing, or like this thing of ours. That's what members refer to it as.
Yeah.
So each family kind of has like a boss who's like the head. A popular media term would be Godfather. As far as I can tell, it's just a media term popularized by the movie. They didn't refer to themselves as Godfather. I think there were instances of them referring themselves as the father of the family, but Godfather itself is mostly just a media term. So there's the boss, who's like the head honcho, and the other two administration members or parts of the administration are the consigliere, which means counselor essentially, who's like the counselor to the boss, and that counselor will give like advice and like information to the boss, and will help settle member disputes, because the boss at the end of the day doesn't get like muddy with like the guys below him. He's kind of like separated.
Right.
So that's kind of what the consigliere is in a basic term, or a basic way to say it. The underboss is something that I'd refer to as like kind of like an under manager, or like literally underboss to the boss. So let's say the boss is the president, the underboss would be like the vice president.
Right.
Technically speaking, they're second in command. But you know, they hold a lot of power, especially on the street. They're also referred to as street bosses sometimes. But yeah, those three are kind of like the moving parts of like what runs the family. Underneath the underboss are capo regimes, or captains. They're super powerful in their own right. There's been times where captains have run like a ruling panel running the family. Pretty much captains are senior or powerful members who are in charge of their own crews in certain areas. So let's say there's a family in one part of the city, right? They'll have like crews in like different boroughs. So there's like a Brooklyn crew, a Bronx crew, you know, referring to New York, Queens crew. And usually the person who's in the nitty gritty running those crews are the capo regimes, captains. Below them are, which is pretty much the first level of being a member, is a soldier. You know, there's soldiers. If you're a soldier, you're doing very well for yourself. It means you're fully initiated. You're a full-blown member. You know, like even if you're not like running the family, it's still a very important thing to be a quote-unquote made member.
Right.
And you know, obviously there's soldiers in these crews. There's something known as associates. They're not really members, and I wouldn't even say they're not in the mafia. They're more so just like they're just criminals who like work with the mafia essentially. There are some associates who are a little bit more ingrained. They're usually known as on record associates. So for example, like a soldier will tell an associate, "You're working just for me, you're not working for anyone else." And that's probably the closest an associate, especially if they're not Italian, can get to being made, as if you're formally like in a crew as an associate. And then there's the other type that's not on the record, where you're just kind of like a free agent essentially.
Yeah.
And those are pretty much the ranks. So boss, consigliere, underboss is the administration, and captains, which are like middle managers, and then soldiers that are like members, and then associates under them.
So the associate, he makes the money, and then he kicks up to the captain, who kicks up to...
So at the end of the day, like technically speaking, the mafia is just a giant pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm not like joking about that. Like it is essentially just that for criminals. You know.
Yeah. the commission?
Salvatore Maranzano and Luciano are pretty much. I don't want to say had the idea because, from what I understand, it was an idea that was being kicked around by multiple people,
Right.
but it was popularized and like put into place by Sal Maranzano and Luciano, Charlie Luciano.
Yeah.
Though the five families already existed in some format in New York at that point, you know, like Joe Masseria, you had Tommy Gagliano running the now Lucchese's,
Yeah.
Vincent Mandel, like all these like early guys, right? So what the commission did is it kind of formalized a structure and a way of doing things where instead of fighting each other all the time, each of these families, five families in New York, and then Buffalo and Chicago, and the other families throughout the states weren't necessarily commission members, but they fell under commission authority. So yeah, it was pretty much just New York's way of organizing Cosa Nostra as a whole under like the same set of rules. So you know, uh, the popular one that isn't necessarily true is no drugs.
Yeah.
Making rules for like making members. You know, pretty much just like a city ordinance type thing. Like, you know, this way people aren't just running off and like doing their own thing. There's like overarching rules that every family essentially has to go by, and that is at the end of the day what the commission is. It's like a board of directors for the mafia with each family. Gambino, Bonanno, Luchesse, Genovese, Colombo. They're the five in New York City. All five of those made up the original commission, like I said, plus Buffalo and Chicago.
Right.
But New York was kind of interesting, you know, because most other cities in the States, even if they had a crime family, it was like one or at best maybe two operating in the region. Like California, for example, had like, you know, Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco family. That was nothing compared to New York. You know, New York had these five families, not necessarily all on the same level as I'll get into, but you know, that's kind of what made New York interesting is, you know, you had five families of, you know, families that had like 100-ish, if not more guys each, you know, so the dynamic was very interesting in New York, I would say. Historically, Gambino and Genovese are and were the most powerful. You know, Carlo Gambino is the namesake of the Gambinos. Vito Genovese is the namesake of the Genovese. Even though Luciano was the first like commission recognized quote unquote Genovese boss, you know, but they pretty much renamed it after that point. Obviously, there's been multiple bosses through the decades.
Right.
But yeah, I'm just going by the namesakes here. So like
Okay.
Colombo, yeah, Tommy Lucchese is the namesake of the Lucchese family. Before him, it was a guy named Tommy Gagliano.
Right.
But you know, Lucchese was in power for like a long time. So Colombo was originally it was the Perfacci family, and they got renamed into you know, under Joe Colombo, it's the Colombos. Bonanno, Joe Bonanno, by the way, just throwing it out there, was like the youngest boss on the commission. He was like 26 at the
Yeah.
time. So he was in power for a long time. So it's known as the Bonanno family. Maranzano Salvatore was before him. And then yeah, that's pretty much like the five families and their namesakes for New York, you know.
The Gambinos had the most soldiers in their crew.
Yes, yeah, like I said, so like Gambino and Genovese were pretty much the two most powerful, and even if it was like indirectly, they kind of like historically have pulled the others along. Like they also were commission representatives for like smaller families. So like Gambino kind of represented the DeCalvacante, which is the New Jersey family on the commission.
Right.
And Genovese, even though Chicago outfit was on the commission, Genovese were kind of like their go-to, like they were linked to Chicago. And then Genovese also represented Philly later on, the Philadelphia crime family.
Right.
And then the other three were always weaker. I would say Lucchese historically was the third most powerful, maybe not the third most biggest. I would give that to the Bonannos. But in terms of like just respect and like authority, I would say Lucchese's. In my opinion, this might be up for debate. There's probably some people out there who would say Bonanno, but I would say Lucchese's were probably third on the rung, especially at the peak from like the 50s to the 80s at least.
Yeah.
And then the thing about the Bonannos is the thing the Bonannos are known for is it's just constant bullshit, for a better word. Whether there's like power struggles, or like, Joe Messino, who's the boss in the 90s. He was like the first big Five Families boss to rat. Then of course there's I'm sure you've seen Donnie Brasco. There's the Donnie Brasco situation where they let a FBI agent into the family. So yeah. So the Bonannos have had kind of they've always been the black sheep. Like at one point they were kicked off the commission briefly because of the Donnie Brasco situation.
Yep.
And they did bounce back in the 90s, like as a very powerful family, but the whole Joe Messino thing, which I mentioned before, kind of fucked them again. And I'll get into like the current leadership later on, but yeah, the Bonannos are a bit of a mess in my opinion, so that's why I wouldn't, even if they had more guys maybe than the Lucchese's, especially considering they had like a crew up in Canada at one point, maybe even still, depending on who you ask. I would still put the Lucchese's above the Bonannos. But as much of a mess as the Bonannos are, the Colombos are small and they're also historically a mess. Like whether it's like the 60s stuff with like the Profaci Gallo War,
Yep.
then Joe Gallo or Joe Colombo and Gallo again had beef, and we'll get into that maybe in like a future episode. But
Yeah.
and then lastly, there was like the 90s war between Vic Arena, who was like he was like the acting boss / street boss for Carmine Persico, who was the Colombo boss for a long time, especially throughout the 80s. I think technically he was officially boss until 2019 when he died, but he was on the street since like the 80s. So I guess Arena at that point in the 80s, 90s was kind of like, why the hell is this guy the boss if he's in jail type of thing, So
Yeah.
the family kind of split in two, and the Colombos have always been the most violent, I would say, in terms of just like shooting it out. A lot of innocent people caught in the crossfire in that 90s war. Like there was a bakery boy,
Yeah.
I don't remember his name, he got killed. I think they accidentally shot a nun at one point, like just like a mess. But yeah, so that's kind of the dynamic there. It's Gambino, Genovese have kind of been always the big dogs, and then Lucchese kind of fell in the middle up until like I would say the 90s. They got pretty violent too with the 80s, 90s. Vicamuso and Gaspipe Casso, very violent guys. They were running the family.
Yeah.
But up until that point, Lucchese was pretty solid, and and then Bonanno and Colombo are behind those.
Gas pipe Casa was a sick fuck.
Yeah, a lot of people give Sammy Gravano, as the guy who flipped on John Gotti, the like the biggest rat, worst guy award, but I don't really think that's true. Definitely a rat, don't get me wrong, pretty bad rat. But Casso was like killing innocent people and going after people's families, and he tried to make a deal, and they straight up said like, you lie all the time, like we don't want you on the stand, and he got fucked pretty much. Like like imagine being so bad like the FBI doesn't want you. Essentially, so that's pretty much what happened with Casso. Just a real dirtbag. I was just gonna say Vicamuso is still currently the Lucchese boss. I'll get into who's running things a little bit after this, like for each of the families. But Amuso is still in jail. He's gonna die in jail most likely. But Amuso is still the boss of the Lucchese's as of right now. Obviously, they have an acting boss, but I'll get into him later.
Right now, the Gambinos. Do we know who is running things over there?
Yeah. So after John Gotti and the Gottis kind of went down the drain with his Junior Gotti, Pete Gotti was boss for a little while, his brother. They kind of reverted back to a Sicilian faction running things. So there's a guy named Dom Cephalou who is he's like a Sicilian mafioso guy. but he's running the family as like the official boss. And then another Sicilian, I guess the current, maybe we'll get into terms later, but like a term for Sicilians historically has been Zips.
Yeah.
So there's like the Zip faction slash, the Cherry Hill Gambinos, they were called. They were like a Gambino crew of Sicilians who were pushing heroin. I don't know if Menino was involved in that, but Menino is definitely part of the Sicilian faction.
Yeah.
So Dom Cephalou is like the official boss, and then Lorenzo Menino is kind of like, I think he was like officially conciliary, but now he's kind of like the street boss. Um, I think those two are the only things we know. I've heard guys like Lou Valario, who was a kind of like a American Gambino Gotti guy, as the conciliary or underboss. I don't remember which, but
Yeah.
Menino and Cephalou are like the things we're certain of, essentially.
Right.
For the Bonannos, it's a guy named Michael Mancuso. He was a guy who was after Messino ratted. There was a guy named Vinny Gorgeous Basciano. He was the acting boss of the Bonannos. They're kind of like a Bronx-based faction of the Bonannos. After Vinny Basciano went to jail, Michael Mancuso kind of became boss. And as far as I can tell, he's not super popular. There's been a lot of like issues with him, like shelving people who, maybe don't deserve it. There was a guy, Joe Camarano, who he was like a super respected Bonanno guy, and he got shelved, and they also shelved his father-in-law, I believe. And Mancuso pretty much told him, like, if you show up, this was like in 2019, 2020, I don't remember exactly when, but they told him, like, if you show up to your father-in-law's funeral, we're gonna like beat the fuck out of you. And
Yeah.
he showed up with a group of bikers, and they're just really disgusting behavior. Like, there was like a brawl in a fucking funeral home, essentially, between these like Bonanno guys. So that's kind of the legacy that Mancuso has right now. Um, he also killed his wife supposedly in the 80s. He like did time for that. I think it was manslaughter, but that's what they're saying. Um,
I didn't know that one.
yeah, so in the 80s, he like pretty much, his wife had a gunshot wound, and this is all, again, like, this is all publicly available information,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then she was like found on the park bench. But yeah, so that's, and then there's a guy named Joe Spirito, who's like the underboss of the Bonannos. Um, the conciliary, I keep hearing mixed things about, so I'm not gonna like make a statement on who the conciliary is for the Bonannos.
Yeah.
But the underboss is this guy Joe Spirito, who apparently is pretty respected. Um, Moving on to Lucchese's. As I said before, like Vicamuso is like the official boss. But then after he went to jail, there was kind of like a lot of like acting bosses, like Little Al Diarco, in no particular order, Matthew Madonna, Stephen. There's a guy Stephen Crea who was he was like the underboss, but he was like kind of functioning as a street boss. But yeah, right now it's a guy named Mike DeSantis. He's the acting boss of the Lucchese's. He's kind of like a loyalist to Amuso. There has been talk that this guy George Zappola is going to replace him, but Zappola was just caught up. I don't know if you heard, there was like a New Jersey gambling bust recently, and he
Yeah.
got caught up. Yeah, so he got caught up in that. I'm not going to go too into that now, but that's kind of like the last big news we have about Lucchese's.
Yeah.
Their Jersey crew pretty much got arrested. Um, Genovese, the boss right now is this guy Barney Belomo. He's been boss for a long time. Not We don't know a lot about him. Apparently he came up under the Shin Gigante. But yeah, the Genovese have always been pretty mysterious. But he's the boss right now for the Genovese. For the Colombos, it's after Persico went away, there was kind of like again after the '90s war and whatnot. In the 2010s, it was this guy Andrew Russo, who was like I guess like he was Persico's cousin. He died a few years ago, and then they replaced him with this guy Robert D'Onofrio, who was originally, as far as I can tell, I could be wrong on this, he was a member of the Victor Arena faction during that 90s war we were talking about, but
Yeah.
he switched sides to the Persico faction. And he's the boss right now, acting boss, sorry. Yeah, that's kind of the New York side of things. All five of the New York families are still active right now, to varying degrees of success. The Philadelphia crime family, I would say they're probably the most powerful, and they've been the most powerful on the East Coast outside of NYC.
I agree.
Obviously, historically, Angelo Bruno was the boss, and then he was killed, and he was replaced with the Chicken Man Testa, and then he got blown up. So a lot of violence in that family. Nicky Scarfo was boss for a while. Little Nicky Scarfo, murderous lunatic,
He was a mess.
5 foot like 2, whatever, right? Napoleon complex. And then when he went to jail, he tried to hold on to the family for a while, but he couldn't. So they handed it over to this guy, John Stanfa. This was in the 90s, and then Stanfa fought a well-publicized war with Joey Merlino, who was the boss of Scarfo's former underboss, Chucky Merlino.
Yeah.
And according to the feds, at least, Merlino took over. Then he was sent to jail on something, and then he got out, and up until recently was supposedly running the family. Now it's kind of up in the air after Merlino got quote unquote shelved or retired, whichever way you want to say it.
Yeah.
There's I've heard names thrown around like George Borghese, Mike Lancelotti. These are just like names the FBI are throwing out. When it comes to Philly, I kind of have doubts about things just because historically the FBI, especially under the Joey Merlino regime, they've kind of like gone after him for like every little thing. And I just don't really believe some of the stuff the FBI says about Philly now. But we do know that they're still an active family, and they're probably the most powerful outside of New York. The other active families are Buffalo. Buffalo has a lot of like Canadian stuff going on. They have crews in Ontario. Allegedly, the head of the Buffalo guys is this guy Joe Todaro. He owns like a pizza place, La Nova Pizzeria in Buffalo. They're a very low-key family. We don't know a lot about them right now, but historically they have had ties to Canada through Ontario. There's the Patriarcha / New England family in Boston, Rhode Island, New England. They're still active. I don't know how big they are at this point, but there's this guy Carmine D'Annunzio. He's supposedly the boss. So that's the East Coast. Yeah, obviously there's the DeCalvacantes. I think the boss currently is this guy Charles Majuri. I don't know pronounce his last name, but they're another like low key family. The Sopranos as a show has kind of fucked with their legacy a bit. A lot of people kind of hear Jersey family and they think like on the show it's like, oh, it's a pygmy thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jersey historically was always pretty powerful, even if they were under the thumb of the New York families. But they're still active. They're I would say they're doing all right.
Some of them got pinched because of the Sopranos.
Yeah. There was that famous case where these guys were on wiretap talking about the show and being like, "Oh, was that me?" You know. Then like the last big thing I remember about the DeCalvacantes are there was this guy Giovanni Rocco. He was like an FBI agent, and he pretty much like it's kind of a weird Donnie Brasco situation. This is in like the 2000s. He like snuggled up to this guy Charles Stango or Stanjo. He was a capo in the family, and that was a big sting with the DeCalvacantes. A lot of guys got arrested. That's kind of the last news I've heard about them. Stango's out now, as far as I know. Moving out to the Midwest, the only family, even though they did have historically a lot of families in the Midwest, like Cleveland, Kansas, Milwaukee, the Chicago outfit has always been like the big family out like in the Midwest and has kind of held power over the Midwest. They're still active. They're supposedly on their last legs, according to most people. Seems like the current status of Chicago is they have captains, but captains are kind of like running their own crews as like mini families, and it's very like decentralized.
Yeah.
There is a guy who's is or was boss Solly De Laurentiis, but he's super old, and I'm not going to comfortably say what exactly is going on with Chicago. They're around. I'm not going to say they're dead, but I think they have a good chance of dying out before the New York families do.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. And then I guess technically it's just Chicago, Buffalo, the five families, Philly, and New England.
There's no more Kansas City? Anything over there?
Well, so Kansas, I was gonna say is there are still members alive of Kansas, like guys who are like still alive who were inducted, but there's no proof. Like they're all super old, and there's no proof that there's any real structure. What this Bernstein guy was talking about claims is that, and I think Jeff Nadu also says this, the sit down podcast guy.
Yeah.
He pretty much says, and I'm inclined to agree, that there are guys from the quote unquote Kansas family who are still alive and kicking, but it's a lot of like they're pretty much just doing their own thing. They might be gambling and having some gambling stuff, but no one's kicking up to anyone. They're just kind of committing crimes if they are committing crimes, and there's no real structure to Kansas.
Yeah.
It was a powerful family at one point. They were involved in the Vegas skim. But now I'd be very surprised if there was like a group ID'd with a structure there. The last one I'll talk about briefly before we move on is the Los Angeles family. They're most likely defunct or not active now. There's a guy, Tommy Gambino, who he's like the last known boss. He's still alive. I think he's in his 50s. Like he's still pretty young. He was tied to the Gambino family. He was related to those Cherry Hill Gambinos I mentioned earlier, the
Right.
Sicilian faction. So we know he was inducted into Los Angeles. But Los Angeles has been super weak since the 90s.
Yeah, they could be on the ground right now. Who knows?
Well, the thing about Los Angeles is they never really had like a large Italian population,
No. Yeah.
Like even back in their heyday under Jack Dragna and those guys, Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano from like the 40s to like the 80s, they didn't have a lot of guys. They definitely they had hardcore members who were killers and stuff, but it was never really like on the New York or on any of the East Coast family level.
Nope.
Do you want to get into like some of the popular terms that like people throw around now when they're talking about the mafia?
So we have Omerta, which is the code of silence.
Yeah. I'll just briefly say like Omerta, yeah, it's code of silence, but it's not even just that. Like a lot of people have this idea. It's like Omerta means like, let's say I kill someone and the cops come and I don't say anything to them. Yeah, that's Omerta. But Omerta is also me not saying anything to. Let's say you're involved. I don't say anything to you. I could kill someone with you, and
Right.
then the next day you could ask me that, and I'll be like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Like it's never happened. That's Omerta.
Yeah.
There's a guy. I forget his name. There's a Chicago outfit guy. Nowadays, I want to say like something Carparelli. I don't remember his name. He's still alive. He's a Chicago outfit member. He has a tattoo that says Omerta on him, which kind of like defeats the point. But that's where the mafia is now. So like the mafia nowadays is they're neutered. They're a bit of a joke. Obviously, there's still some hardcore criminals involved, guys actively committing crimes. But as a culture, it's very stereotype of itself. I think
Oh,
Hollywood has done just as much damage to the mob as the feds have.
I agree with that, actually.
Like You know, these guys, I wonder if they talk and act and use certain words if they didn't see it in movies first. Like, again, going back to the whole the Cavalcante thing, like they're talking about The Sopranos. You know, you have some of these like X-Wise guys like liking Mafia movie pages on Instagram, and it's
Yeah,
like, you know, like it used to legitimately be like a secret society, and now it's kind of like a lot of people, they kind of like, they want people to know about it, you know, even if they won't outright say it, they kind of do like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge type of thing.
right. The mafia, they operated by fear, but they also wanted silence. So it was like a double-edged sword with that. Because
Yeah,
if no one knows you, they can't fear you. So
yeah. Well, and that's the thing. It's like, and this is kind of like the stuff that like Joe Colombo, like, he was, you know, he was the Colombo boss, obviously back then, but he had this Italian American Civil Rights League, and he pretty much was like, oh well, yeah, there's Italian gangsters, but there's no like Italian like organized crime. And I think that's what some of these old timers did. It's like they knew people knew that there were Italian criminals, and maybe they relied on that for fear, like, oh yeah, like there's a gang or there's a gangster or gang member. But you know,
yeah,
they I don't think they that doesn't mean they necessarily say, oh, the mafia is this and that and that. It's more so just like, oh, this guy's a tough guy who's gonna break your fucking head open. You know what I
exactly.
mean?
Yep.
Like you don't walk nowadays. It probably happens. You have guys walking up. Oh, I'm made in such and such family. Back then, it's probably just walk up, punch, whatever, right?
Yeah. Plus now there's like a ring camera everywhere. You can't even walk up to somebody anymore.
Yeah,
So
well, there's so many wires and like, you know, wire taps and um you know, everyone knows what it is now. Anyone who denies the mafia is a thing is like I see that sometimes with like guys in like Instagram comments. They're like, oh, there's no mafia, and it's like you can tell they're just saying that because they want to be seen as like, oh, I'm keeping Omerta or like whatever. And it's like, dude, you're not fooling anyone. Like we know that there was and is
yeah,
Italian American organized crime that follows tradition. Like, you know, I would understand if you know, there was no proof of anyone having ranks or getting inducted and it was just a bunch of Italian gangsters running around, then I would say, okay, maybe there is no Italian mafia, maybe it's just Italian gangs. But like we still know, you know, and you know, sure, yeah, informants lie, but and that's kind of the excuse some of these active guys use. It's like, oh, informants are the rats are lying about like there being this and that and that. That's like, how come every rat is saying the same thing? You know what I
exactly.
mean? There's another group, as I mentioned before, the Ndrangheta. They're the Calabrian mob. They're doing way better than American LCN is now. They're also doing better than the Camorra in Italy. These guys are in like every continent. You know, they're in Australia, they're in Europe. Um, the Ndrangheta are like they're super bloodline oriented. So when you say like a family, they're like a literal family. Like a
Right.
father, let's say a father is an Ndrangheta member or an Ndrangheta clan member, his sons, they don't make people, his sons are born and they're automatically members of that group. And they're cousin, they're really, you know, they're cousins, and it's like a literal bloodline, pretty much, and they're everywhere. The Ndrangheta we're gonna have to do a whole other episode about because I'd be here for like 5 hours.
Yeah.
It's a super mysterious organization, but they're probably like the premier Italian mafia organization right now.
When I think of them, I think of a cartel.
Yes, yes, and historically, not just the Ndrangheta, but in Italy, all those organizations operate more akin to cartels. I'm talking car bombs, killing judges, killing civilians.
uh,
Um, you know, they're way more vicious over in Italy in general, not just the Ndrangheta, but all those different groups.
yeah, the bosses were literally living in tunnels back then.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a whole different culture over there. Like people are bored into it, you know,
Yeah,
and that's your life here, like or in America. You know, it's still kind of like a subculture that people fall into. You know.
yeah. In America, it's different because in Italy back in the day, a lot of them didn't have a choice.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that is true of certain people in the mafia in America, like guys whose fathers were inducted or like, whatever, like guys who grew up in certain areas, like, they probably couldn't escape it. But um American society is just so different from Italy, like American society, like these guys probably aren't gonna want to kill civilians, and
Right.
they know if they do, they're not gonna get away with it. Whereas in Italy,
It's
they knew they
such
they knew they could get away with it, just because I don't want to call Italy like third world, but it wasn't as developed as the States,
especially
and some areas still aren't as developed as the States. So you can get away with a lot more. It's like Mexico,
yeah, some parts of Naples and Sicily, it's still pretty bad over.
So yeah, that's the big difference. It's like, yeah, there's, again, like even though like the American mafia is like an offshoot and they're tied to the Sicilian mafia, it's still a different ball game.
Yeah.
But it's I was just gonna say quickly, like it's kind of weird though. Some families have more like Camorra leanings than others, like Al Capone and I think John Torrio, who were kind of like the first outfit bosses. They were Camorrista, like they had ties to the Camorra, and a lot of early Genovese guys also were from that area too. So those two families are slightly more akin to like, I mean, they follow the Sicilian structure, but in terms of like blood, early members of both those families were like Camorra
Yeah.
affiliated.
They depicted Capone in Boardwalk Empire. He said something to Lucky. He called him a Sicilian piece of crap.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know their relationship in real life, but you do see that a little bit with the Chicago outfit. Even though they were, a LCN organization, there's still people out there who, and I think I was talking about this to someone recently, where like there's people who don't think the Chicago outfit was LCN because they were a little bit different. I'm just gonna say this right off the bat. We know the Chicago outfit inducted people. They had making ceremonies. Um, like Nick Calabrese, who was a early on it Chicago informant, says that, and a few other informants say that. So I think the confusion is early FBI charts of the Chicago outfit have this weird structure where it doesn't use terms like boss, captains, soldiers like it does now. It uses weird, like if you look up like 1960s Chicago outfit chart, it's weird. It says like, oh, street lieutenant, blah blah blah, board of directors, counselor to this, and it uses all these weird terms that are confusing where it doesn't even look like LCN.
Yeah.
And I will say, yes, historically Chicago did have a lot of non-Italian associates who rose up to high positions, but if you look at those early '60s charts, like it has guys like Gus Alex, who's a very powerful like associate above like members. And so
Right.
it kind of creates this confusion that like, oh, associates were like above like members, and like you could be a member if you weren't Italian, and that's not technically true.
Yeah. They did run it differently, and the violence was more insane than I think any family in New York.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like I said before, like Colombo, Bonanno, all the families in New York were pretty violent. But Chicago, I think, has a higher number of like gruesome, well-known murders.
In the early days, the Atlantic City Conference, they had that. So Nucky Johnson, he, him, Torrio, Capone was there, Rothstein, and a few other people I can't think off the top of my head. But they wanted to stop the violence because the Valentine's Day massacre happened. So Capone goes I think he went to Philly. I forget where he went, and he got pinched on a gun charge. But they're saying like maybe someone dimed him out just to keep the peace for like a year because he only did a year for the pistol.
Yeah, that stuff that I guess it's known as like the National Crime Syndicate. That
Yeah.
like early on, it's kind of like a proto commission kind of.
Hmm.
Um, I guess that was like an early attempt at that. You have a lot of like the rules back then were different. Like you even have like Luciano apparently like gave up some like heroin to the cops. I think they show that briefly in Boardwalk Empire, but
Yeah, yeah,
technically like yeah, Luciano would be considered a rat by like today's standards.
it's true.
I think obviously the commission like made it more powerful, which I guess to the average person maybe was a bad thing because it made this organization way more powerful, but it also did stop that kind of like shooting in the street violence that the prohibition era was known for.
Yeah,
But they've been murdering people for ages, from then to now throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, killings left and right. um the early 2000s kind of calmed down for some of the families. There were still like Bonanno guys killing people. I think the last made guy was this guy, Little Anthony Secafito. I could be mispronouncing his name. He was a Bonanno member who was killed in 2009. Um, I guess he was like skimming money from like members, and also he was like kind of pissing off Nick Santoro. I don't remember his name. One of the capos was pissed off because he didn't get him the right size suit. He was just acting like a dickhead pretty much. And this guy was at the bus stop, which is a little weird as like a made guy. You're taking the bus, but whatever. And they shot him dead in the street. So that's 2009. That's the last made guy of a five family or mafia in general to be killed. So if
uh,
you look up Michael Meldish hit, that's the last like official like New York mafia hit, and then the 2009 Little Anthony hit was the last like made guy killed.
and then well, this ain't really a hit, but Frank Cali.
Yeah, that's a weird fucking situation, man. That was pretty much like a schizophrenic kid.
Yeah,
Who, by the way, did have some mob ties. Apparently, he was friends with there's a guy Joe Amato, who was
yep.
he's a Colombo capo. That guy, the kid, I forget his name. He was friends with Joe Amato's kid, so he did have some mild LCN links, but it wasn't an LCN hit. It was just a crazy guy who was like a wannabe gangster who started a beef with Cali and killed him.
Yep.
I think he like hit his car outside and he like drew him out and then just shot him in the street.
Yeah, that was like 15 minutes away from me too.
Yeah, I remember you telling me. Yeah, yeah. That's what is that? Was that it? That was in Staten Island, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. What was that like 2020? I want to say 2019.
2019, I believe.
Obviously, there's probably like a recruiting issue now with the mafia. Like a lot of these guys, especially the Colombos, dude. If you look at a Colombo chart, they're all like above the age of like 56. Even like the associates. But I think any young guys they do get, it's probably gonna be from like media, like these young poor or like hoodlum guys who are like, oh shit, like I find this cool, and then they want to be like it. Like
Yeah.
there's this guy Peter Pantuccio. I guess he's like a Philly associate now. He was like in his 20s, and he like hooked up with Joey Merlino through Instagram, and this is a guy in his 20s, and now he's like a Philadelphia associate, and he's, as far as I know, he's one of the younger associates. He's in jail now for torching a car. Um, but that's kind of who they're getting now, are these young guys who are like romanticizing it. That's their recruitment pool now.
I don't know if that's a good thing.
Well, and there lies the problem. It's before you had guys who kind of they fell into it, or they had to join it, or they didn't know any better maybe. I'm not one of those people who think like, oh, if you're in the mafia, you're a scumbag. Like, I think there are legitimately people who just grew up into it, and to them that's normal. Like, not every person in the mafia is a fucking Anthony Casso or Sammy Gravano. Some of them are just like business guys who are a little bit shady and whatever, right? Not
Yeah.
every single one is like a sociopathic like killer. But the problem is nowadays, I feel like it's gonna attract more so those people, because now you have guys growing up into it or around it who like they actively want to join it.
Right.
Like it's not like they really have to anymore. Like they're not like some poor Italian immigrant from the 1950s. They they have options, and if you actively look out and like be like, oh, I want to be a gangster, that's like a different breed of person than like these guys who grew up into it through bloodlines and whatever, right?
Yeah. I know in Italy, when I was reading Saviano's book, the Camorra, he said that there's kids that would rather
Yeah,
make $300 a week with the Camorra than make 400 a week doing a regular job because they want the recognition, the fear, they want the fame. That's how.
yeah, that's like a universal thing though. Like there's always going to be young kids who whether they're black, Hispanic, whatever, they see like these guys and they want to be like them, and
Yeah,
it's an issue of like authority figures essentially, and it is a flashy lifestyle, dude. Like nice cars, guns, whatever, but you don't last very long.
no,
Canada's a different story, dude. Like on the East Coast, like again, like historically, it's been Buffalo, the Buffalo crime family, and some Ndrangheta stuff in Ontario, and then Quebec was it was technically a Bonanno crew, and then they depending on who you ask, they might have went independent. It's commonly referred to as the Risotto crime family. Um, I don't. My opinion is they're probably independent at this point, but historically they were under the Bonannos. Dude, there's people getting shot in like broad daylight to this day, like mafia related stuff.
right. All right, that's enough for this podcast with Sirius and Pete. We'll catch you on the next one.
Yep. Have a good one, guys.